I'm putting my watch here so that I can keep an eye on the time. Namibia is a favourite country of mine in so many ways, and as Charles kindly said, I've covered it for many years. In fact, I have to admit it goes back even a bit further to the 1970s when I was a young man, and I first met very impressive representatives of what was then the National Liberation Party, SWAPO, South West African People's Organisation, rather peculiarly because, of course, the country is known as Namibia, but when they formed themselves, it was South West Africa. And I was so impressed by the calibre of the people that were diplomatically and in other ways trying to achieve independence for their country. And it's never left me, that initial impression. So for many reasons, I've decided quite some time ago, after the country became independent, well, I'm going to keep covering it because I want to see a success in Africa. Now, it's not 100% successful, but if you look at Africa, there are quite a few countries that are in that sort of area of near to success. Right, the first slide that you have on this screen in front of you, why have I chosen that? I could have chosen a lovely slide of the wonderful landscapes of Namibia, but this epitomises something about Namibia. Here we have the black rhino, as you know, one of Africa's very engendered wildlife species. It was almost extinct 5 or 6 years ago. It's come back through conservation efforts on the ground and through the help of international charities. And in Namibia, it's probably one of the largest conserved herds in Africa. And that rather epitomises, again, the connection between the people of Namibia, because often we talk about African countries economically and we don't talk about the people, and their wildlife, because this is a hugely important thing for Namibia. It's not just a tourist attraction, but increasingly you have local communities who are being steered in the direction of appreciating that wildlife brings benefits to them. Right, let's move on. Here's the map. I think it tells you it shows you all you really need to know. Effectively, Namibia is a very large country. It's got an extraordinarily long coastline. The coastline is desert, mainly. It's the Namib Desert, which is where the name comes from. And Namib actually means shield. And that was very appropriate because for many years, European explorers didn't land on the coastline. It was too hostile. And then inland, you have the Kalahari Desert down in the southeast. Let's see if I can do this. Am I doing it right? Yeah, there we are, going into Botswana. Here you have Windhoek, which is the original German name, which means windy place. And you've got two major ports, but the biggest one is Walvis Bay. And then down there is Luderitz, which is much smaller. Up here you have Etoshapan, which is where a lot of the wildlife is. The road connections you can see. And the crucial thing about these is that Namibia is now, it wasn't at independence, very well connected to neighbouring countries, Zambia and Botswana in particular. And of course, via Botswana, this doesn't show this, but there you have Gobabis, and that road, the Trans-Kalahari, goes through Botswana and into Gauteng province of South Africa, which of course is the major industrial area. So through those connections, Namibia has good links with its neighbouring countries, both in terms of trade and commerce. Otherwise, the map, I think I will leave it at that, and I'll come back to anything on the next map. Well, I've given you some facts and figures here on its size. 14 regions. Why has Namibia got 14 regions? Well, at independence, under South African administration, there'd been the introduction of apartheid, separate facilities for different races. So they'd attempted in Namibia to introduce the concept of separate homelands for indigenous black people. At independence, obviously, that wasn't going to continue. So they came up with regions that were based on geographical features rather than traditional tribal areas of habitation. So that's why there's 14. And they've worked quite well. They're representative of the regions that they are formed for. I would say devolution hasn't really worked. That's one area that still needs to be worked on. Apart from the two deserts I pointed out on the map, you've got the very fertile central plateau where a lot of the commercial farms are. And a lot of the mineral resources are in the south and centre of the country. The sea surface area I've highlighted, mainly because Namibia is unique in some ways, because its sea surface area is, 2/3 the size of the land area, which means it's got huge potential marine-wise. It's exploited for sea fishing. My speaker after me will talk about the oil potential, but there's also potential for offshore minerals such as phosphates and, as I'll come to later, diamonds. Connecting links, it's important to know that Namibia is part of the Southern African Development Community. There's a concerted drive to expand usage of Walvis Bay for regional trade, and that's worked quite well. Zambia and Botswana export a proportion of their products to Walvis Bay. It's a containerized port, and that is expanding. The spatial distribution of Namibia's population. Why have I put this up? Well, because it's extraordinary, really. If you look at that map, there in the north, you see a concentration of population right along the border with Angola, and then to a lesser extent going east to the northeast, and that part of Namibia that sticks out into the right of the map used to be called the Caprivi Strip, after the German politician in the colonial era of the 19th century who negotiated that extra bit of land with the British. It's now called Zambezi because that's the main river. And then further south than that, the population is very scattered, apart from Windhoek, which is 150,000 plus, and probably more because there are large-scale informal settlements outside Namibia, which is one of the issues that is being now looked at with some degree of urgency. And then there on the coast, where on the left in the centre down there, it looks like there's not many people there. This map is probably about 5 years old, so those areas have expanded a bit, Walvis Bay and inland, because of the attraction of the oil sector, which has brought more people to work on the coast, and the mining sector, uranium mining in particular. Population parameters. Well, this is, in some ways, typically African. Rural population is still bigger than the urban, but actually Namibia is quite relatively urbanized, although a lot of the population, as I've said, some of them are in semi-peri-urban settlements, and the urban population is very concentrated in only a few centres. Annual population growth is not high, but it will hit 3 million projected to by 2031. AIDS and HIV infection rates have decreased, so the actual mortality incidence in the population has gone down from that source of illness. But of course there are other endemic diseases which occasionally break out. Although Namibia being a dry climate generally, apart from the north to the northeast, some of the kind of endemic diseases you get in much of tropical Africa don't really apply in Namibia. It's a very young population. The low population density, well, it has actually increased since independence, but it's still a fact. The unequal distribution we've referred to. This then feeds into the next slide. Because that imbalance of the population, and well, it's partly due to the climate, because of course Namibia is a semi-dry, arid country in much of the territory, but not all of it. So obviously you're not going to find people down in the southwest of the map, as I showed you, which is where the diamonds are recovered. It's virtually unfarmable. It's not very amenable to human habitation. But the real thing there is I have called it a twice colonized country. Now, that could be controversial. Germany, indeed, was the first colonial power, late 19th century. In 1915, during the First World War, the South Africans, in association with the British, sent in an army. German army defeated. At that point, South Africa became the occupying power. This was legitimised by the League of Nations after the First World War. I shouldn't give you too much history, but although that was an administration, effectively South Africa treated Namibia as a colony, and it used it both for its abundant mineral resources and also as an area for settlement of quite a large, significant proportion of the white population who during the 20s and 30s could not find work in South Africa, and they were offered land which had originally been seized by the Germans in the early 20th century for white settlers from South Africa. So in that sense, I think everyone in Namibia regards the South African period as a period of colonial rule. Coming back to Germany, now actually Germany is still Namibia's largest bilateral aid donor. The Chinese haven't yet supplanted it. And historically, there are huge links between the two countries, but unfortunately, there was a very nasty period when there was an uprising, 1904. The two main communities then were the Over-Herero semi-nomadic community and the Nama in the centre and the south of the country. Both were major cattle owners. They rose up because there'd been an outbreak of cattle disease. They saw European settlers encroaching on their traditional land, and it was rather violently repressed. There was a German general sent over in charge of the expeditionary force called General Lothar von Trotha, and he effectively, after there'd been a battle and the Herero had been defeated, he then said, no, well, we're going to kind of actually deal with this for good. And so there was actually literally an extermination order issued. The result was that about 80% of what was then the largest community in Namibia disappeared, lost their lives. Some were driven across the desert into Botswana, where there was a large community of Namibians of Herero origin at independence who returned. So that was the background, and that is why at the moment there is a Namibian government delegation that has been for the past 2 years negotiating in Berlin with the German government about a measure of recompense. The Germans won't accept the term that was used when they compensated the Jewish community. The genocide is what the Namibians say was carried out in their land, but it's formal reparations. Germany is resistant to that idea. They've apologised, but they haven't accepted that they should pay formal reparations. So those discussions are still ongoing, and they're quite complex because the Namibian government is representative broadly of all the main communities in Namibia on the African side, and indeed the white community, because there are 2 white cabinet ministers. But the traditional leadership groups of the communities who are most affected by the genocide of the early 20th century are a little bit not quite sure that the government is going to negotiate a deal where they get the benefit, as opposed to it just going into the central government. So they've got their separate court case currently going ahead in New York. So that is one aspect of the ongoing historical impact on Namibia today. I suspect that some kind of arrangement will eventually be negotiated, but it has taken now 3 years. And many German commentators are saying, well, Germany is very resistant to this idea. They've given an apology. A minister went there 5 years ago and said, oh, yes, we're very sorry. But there's a little bit lacking there still. Anyway, independence finally achieved. The UN transition, probably the most successful operation the UN has ever done in all its peacekeeping operations. They sent in a force, peacekeeping troops, South African troops that had been fighting against the MPLA organisation in Angola during the Angolan Civil War, had used Namibia as their rear base, restricted to base, SWAPO guerrillas similar, and then there was a de-apartheization of the legal system and the laws so that free and fair elections could be held. They were held. And because it had been negotiated, Namibia's independence, partly through the Security Council contact group of the 5 Western countries, 3 of them the permanent members, Britain, France and the US, 2 Canada and Germany, then on the Security Council, and a resolution called Resolution 435 of 1979, which had lain dormant for many years. Finally, it was negotiated into a package which brought independence. So to this day, Namibia is completely geared to the UN as the international organisation that they really will not ever leave out of the calculation of how to go forward with Namibia's policy in all aspects. Some of the legacy from the colonial period, as in most countries, there is good as well as the bad. The excellent infrastructure that was left by the South Africans, functioning bulk water supply system, in a semi-desert country, hugely important, which means Namibia, despite being subject to recurrent drought, actually does have water from dams. And on the lighter side, premium beer. Why do I bring that up? Well, the Germans introduced their traditional beer, which, if you know anything about beer, it's water, barley, malt and hops, no chemicals. And this continues to this day, and the brewing company in Namibia is still partly owned by a German Namibian family, Namibia Breweries, and it's renowned for the quality of its beer. It's made inroads into the South African premium beer market, so that is one of the legacies. And indeed, after independence, some of the leaders of the SWAPO party who formed the first government, at the point of time when South African Breweries was an independent company, huge brewing company, took over most of the breweries in the rest of Africa, actually. And the Namibian government said, no. We're going to have our own brewing company that brews distinctive beer. That's one of our heritages from the past. So the Namibian peace, that's what we have now. There has been one incident of a very small group of dissidents in the Caprivi, very short-lived armed uprising in the 1990s. Absolutely nothing else in Namibia. There are causes that you could say, well, there's unrest about the unequal distribution of land. There's still extensive rural poverty, but there's very little conflict between different Namibian communities. In fact, virtually none, except occasional outbreaks of interterritorial disputes over particular land rights in the north mainly, which is the most populous area. The Constitution of 1990 is really what's at the heart of Namibia's ability to maintain peace in the country. Fundamental human rights entrenched, well, it's more than that. Basically, there are fundamental freedoms as part of a Chapter 3 of the Constitution, which include everything that you'd want to see in the most liberal constitution you could imagine. No arbitrary arrests permitted, a right to fair trial, freedom of association, freedom of religion, free press. Since independence, actually, there hasn't been one instance where the government has said to a newspaper, you cannot publish that article. This is almost unheard of throughout most of the developing world. And in fact, Namibia's press is rated, and I'm talking about the press, the written press, which was for many years obviously the main form of media. Now, of course, we have the internet, and we have a much wider variety of ways of communicating. The government controls the main television channel, but there are, other television channels you can watch. Most of the newspapers are independent. The judiciary, although the president does have a role in appointing judges, it's through a commission, so it's not the president who says, yes, I want this judge to go and do that. So it's independent, and any dispute which arises, it will not be the government view that necessarily wins the day. President Hage Geingob, the third Namibian president, and for what it's worth, it's the first who doesn't come from the most populated part of the country. He's from the Damara, which is about the third or fourth biggest community. That meant actually that when he stood for election for the first time in 2014, he won actually a slightly bigger plurality than his two predecessors, partly because the traditional leadership of his community, who actually had in the past supported opposition parties, said, no, we're going to support Hage Geingob. But there's a very difficult transition now underway. We're 30 years almost on from independence in 1990. The leadership that came into power in 1990, aging. Most of them are in their 70s or 80s. Hage Geingob is 78. The first Namibian president, Sam Nujoma, who came into office in 1991, he's in his mid-80s. actually one of the reasons for the longevity of many of these former exiled leaders, because a lot of these guys, mainly guys, to be honest, but there were a lot of women later, but originally it was mainly men, went into exile as young men, first into Africa, then they set up their organisations throughout the world. They had a leadership code. No drink, no alcohol, no tobacco, no smoking, and no drugs. And I don't think it's facetious of me to suggest that perhaps one of the reasons that they're so long-lived and still active is actually they stuck to this quite rigidly. But there is an issue here because the younger generation of Namibians who come to adulthood after independence, I'm not saying they're taking it for granted, but there's a feeling that perhaps they haven't quite appreciated what it took to bring Namibia into existence. And some of the elder leadership are now a little bit concerned that they need to get their message across, that the reason Namibia is peaceful is because, one, the constitution was respected, two, all communities, including white Namibians, were all offered citizenship immediately after independence. And it's about, what is the white Namibian population now? I'd have to look at my sources, but it's only about 5% of the population. None have been expropriated out of any of their private property, whether it's running shops, farms, or any kind of businesses. This is also virtually unique, and that won't change. Right, let's move on. So that feeds into this National Land Conference. Now, I don't want to go on too much about land and agriculture because that may not be most people's area of interest, but it's important because, as I've said, in order to maintain peace, it's important to bring the younger generation into the concept of Namibia being a liberal democracy. But there's huge impatience, understandably, and frustration that a lot of the commercial land still is owned by the minority population, who are called, again, a typically Namibian thing. They try not to talk about white Namibians and black Namibians. They talk about previously advantaged, the white community, and previously disadvantaged, which might sound like a bit of sophistry, but it actually kind of reduces that racial content of these kind of discussions. So the land conference, well, they had one in 91. They agreed that they'd have a policy of redistributing land to indigenous Namibians, but only by buying the land, the government buying the land, list of potentially eligible resettlees, landless Namibians. A bit of controversy about that who's on the list, people have asked. We're not quite sure. Supposedly at one point almost everyone who wasn't a member of the Namibian white community was on the list, including, as it turned out, quite a lot of officials who had nicely well-paid jobs in the civil service by this time. Why are they on the list for getting farms? So that was something that people were a bit suspicious of. One of the things they decided at this conference, which is the second one, just the beginning of the month, was, no, we're going to publish this and be transparent about it. But the clear point is that, unfortunately, the policy of buying land at market price is hugely expensive because the value of farms in Namibia, they're very, commercial farms in Namibia are hugely productive. Namibia produces a large proportion of beef which is distributed worldwide. We've got it in this country. We're a buyer of Namibian beef. So accelerating land redistribution has to be balanced with the need to preserve agricultural productivity. And again, there was some feeling that people had been resettled, and not a very large number of people had been resettled. We're talking about 3% of the freehold agricultural land, 3 million hectares rather, about 6% is now in indigenous hands. So that needs to be accelerated. But how to do that without violating the Constitution, which protects freedom of property rights? So the answer has been, well, we will move towards an expropriation process, but it'll still be with compensation according to the Constitution, which sounds a bit of a contradiction, and I'm not sure how practical it will prove to be in practice. Right, let's move on, because I'm behind my time frame on this. That feeds into the general transformation, what I've called the transformation agenda. Well, that's quite a challenge, really. Capacity is limited, institutional capacity. On the other hand, Namibia has a very strong private sector. The question is how many people are employed by the private sector in a way that will generate wider redistribution, entrepreneurship by the indigenous community. These things are still being sorted, but what the government's tried to do is to provide an environment in which private capital can come in with a range of priorities. Obviously, at the moment, the priority is structural reforms to encourage and leverage private capital, which may include privatisation of parastatals. Some parastatals in Namibia are quite efficient, including the one that runs the ports. Walvis Bay is rated to be one of the better run ports in southern Africa. Others, like the transport parastatal for the land transport, the railway, is not so efficient. So there are, and a lot of them require subsidies. This is a familiar story. So there is some effort to try and work out whether it will be appropriate to have partial privatisation, whether that would be through the Namibian Stock Exchange, because there is an active stock exchange. Now, a key thing that has been on the agenda but has now been taken off, and really because it was viewed by President Geingob, whose wife, by the way, is was very active in business, and now has her own charitable organisation which tries to upgrade skills for Namibians going into the business sector and other sectors. There was a proposal that they would replicate the South African Black Economic Empowerment programme, which has had mixed success. And that's now been taken off the agenda. Earlier this year, they reviewed the draft proposal for that, and the Cabinet decided that it wasn't appropriate to move forward in this way. So there will be some form of empowerment. There already is, in the sense that quite a few companies, including banking companies, have voluntarily introduced empowerment structures. And that's what's going to be encouraged. The vision of an industrialised society, that goal, that goal was set in the 1990s. The key thing is that they're working towards is local beneficiation of raw materials to produce finished export goods. Now, if I move on to the next one, we come to the abundant resource base. There is a lot of potential for doing this. Although Namibia is quite a small economy, GDP is US 13 billion as of last year, the resource base is quite extensive and does provide the facility for expanding local value adding. The question is whether it can be economic to do that, so that is something else that business and government are working on. In some areas it's proved to be an economic development. For example, I've shown you here one of the 5 offshore mining vessels that's operated by the National Diamond Mining Company called Namdeb. Well, that is actually a partnership between the government and De Beers, and all the technology and most of the capital investment is put in by De Beers. The government's 50% share does not commit it to putting in money, but it gets over 50% of the proceeds from diamond mining, and Namibia has a huge diamond heritage. Now it's offshore. The land deposits are declining. These ships, state-of-the-art vessels, I've seen one of them, they're quite extraordinary. That's a landing pad for the helicopters, because that's how the crew get in and on and off the vessel. That's how equipment supplies are brought in. The diamonds are recovered from the seabed and they're processed and sorted on the vessel, which minimises the possibility of smuggling. And diamond output will remain very important, but will shift increasingly offshore, because it's a century since they started mining the deposits on that strip of land, which, by the way, is still called by its German name the Sperrgebiet, which means the prohibited area, which was introduced to try and stop smuggling. And so, if you or I go there, we have to have an advance permission to show we aren't in possession of a criminal record from our local national police before we're allowed anywhere near the diamond area. And then you have to go through the inspection procedure. 5th, by value. I mean, the content of Namibian diamonds is extraordinary. It's not the biggest producer by any means, but it's 95+% gem quality. When it goes offshore, increasing its smaller diamonds but still wealthy. The future of the mineral sector is it's very promising. not only do you have the existing diamond output, existing uranium output, okay, the uranium market's been in a poor state for the last 2 or 3 years, but it's moving up. China is building more and more nuclear power stations, so the need for the product is there, and they own the biggest new mine. And then you've got now new companies coming in looking at battery metals, and some of these will be developed. The sea fishing industry will continue to be productive. I've mentioned commercial agriculture. I won't say anything about the oil industry, obviously, and the exploration sector, but renewable energy. That is something that Namibia has potential, a huge potential for. Real GDP growth, well, you've got the figures there. I don't think I'm going to add too much to it because of time constraints anyway. The crucial thing about real GDP growth is that it slowed in 2016 after there'd been a huge influx of foreign direct investment in developing 3 new mines, one of them being the Husab uranium mine, which the Chinese own. That slowed. Construction sector went into recession. The government had to start cutting back on its spending because the budget deficit had soared, and to try and maintain Namibia's sovereign credit rating, it introduced fiscal consolidation. That reduced government outlays on construction. Consumer demand was depressed. So that's why the economy contracted. But throughout this period, the mining growth has been there. So that's still one of the generators of Namibia's growth. Fiscal consolidation, low inflation environment, rising at the moment because of the rand beginning to fall in value, although not greatly, not like 2 years ago. But that is always the issue because Namibia's currency is 100% linked to the South African rand. So if the South African rand goes down, so does the Namibian currency. So it's the local currency depreciation is an inflation risk. Foreign reserves are quite healthy, but 5 months import coverage, not huge. So obviously that's something to look at. Foreign trade deficit has fallen. Well, I could talk for ages about the competitive environment. I gave you there the ease of doing business, which is the survey done by the World Bank. There's also, of course, the survey done by the World Economic Forum. And actually their more recent global competitive index shows that Namibia was 100th out of 104 countries. That's slightly down from 99 in the previous year. The problem is that Namibia scores well in various areas. Financial system, merchant and retail banks are solvent and well capitalised, well run, backed by South African ownership for 3 out of the 4 main commercial banks. So they can borrow and shift funds from their South African major shareholders. Institutional strength, infrastructure, all good points, but things like starting a business still take far too long. Setting up a business costs very little, but starting a business, that's quite a complex procedure still. So that's an area which the structural reforms that the government is promising to sequentially roll out, it is hoped that will deal with those. That's the idea. Key point is that 5-6 years ago, the then Minister of Mines came up with this idea of reserving so-called strategic minerals to a small government-owned national mining company. That's really dropped because the national mining company doesn't have the capacity or the financial backing to really explore for minerals in its own right. So that idea has been dropped. So therefore that means that sort of, again, that kind of potential disincentive to investors has been removed. There's a lot of separate incentive packages at the moment in Namibia. I mean, the corporate tax rate is 35%, the mining tax rate is 37.5%, diamonds attract a higher tax rate, but there are all kinds of incentive packages. They're so complicated that people have begun to say, no, we don't quite sure. Are we a manufacturing company? Can we get that manufacturing incentive? Do we want to be an export processing zone company? And all these separate packages have operated, and the government's looked at these and said, no, we've got to rationalise that. So that's another thing that's going on. No substantial tax rises in the pipeline. Okay, VAT 15%, that might go up by 1% if the government feels it needs more revenue, but nothing of any major concern. Oops, gone the wrong way here. China. That, of course, is the major partner in most of Africa. Namibia is no exception. The Chinese seem to like Namibia, as do, by the way, a lot of junior mining companies, the Australians, the Canadians and the British, a lot of junior mining exploration companies in Namibia from European and Canadian and Australian sources. But the Chinese have come in, as they've done elsewhere in Africa, offered low interest rate loans with a grant element, very attractive to a government which is always looking to keep its budget under control. But they're not totally dominant. There's space for other investors. It's a source of, China's ready to lend money. Well, obviously an African government is going to say, oh yes, fine, let's borrow that money. It's cheaper than borrowing it on the capital market. And the global capital market, and a good example of that is that Namibia floated 2 euro bonds in the last 6 years. Well, they provided resources, much needed resources for government funding, projects and other priorities, but they've been expensive to service. Namibian partnerships, as I say, are not compulsory, but if you go into Namibia, you'd be very well advised to look for a reputable, and I stress the word reputable, because there are villains out there who will come to you and say, oh, look, give me 20% or 10% or 5%, I will give you access to the president. Forget it, don't take any notice. Because unfortunately, over the last 20 years, not only have you had a growth of business capacity amongst the indigenous people, you have got a sort of group of people with good political connections who, as in many other parts of the world, think, well, the way to operate is to go to a potential investor and say, hey, if you give me a share of the action, I will give you the political access. So that's something to look out for. I've mentioned adequately capitalized I've mentioned adequately capitalized commercial banks. It's also important the Development Bank of Namibia is well financed, and they have quite a well thought through approach to providing project finance. I mentioned training of locals as being key. There are skills in the country, particularly in the resource sector, but obviously overall apprenticeships are key. I mean, one of the biggest mining companies, Rossing, which is currently owned by Rio Tinto, that's the original uranium mining company in Namibia, they have a huge apprenticeship program. 2 things I haven't mentioned, which I'll just wrap up with. Namibia is subject to returning severe drought. In other words, every few years there will be a severe drought. So that is a risk for the economy in general. And when there is a drought, what has happened now in recent years is that water shortages have developed in Windhoek, and they've had to introduce water restrictions. So now there's a realization that given the propensity and given climate change and all the other factors we're all aware of, finding additional water resources is going to be crucial to enabling the manufacturing sector to expand, because without that manufacturing sector, the idea of value adding locally won't happen. And I've left out a few things, but I've said, I think, as much as I can find time to say today. So thank you for listening to me, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Roger. Daniel.
Morning, everybody. I'm very conscious there's a lot of people in this room who know a lot more about Namibia and a lot more about oil and gas than I do. But I'll give a brief summary, and if you want to chip in, please do at the end of any slides just to give your perspectives. I think most people in the room know each other anyway. So you don't need the Cliff Notes guides to Namibia. You've just done a master's course on Namibia, so you can skip through this. But certainly one of the attractions of the international oil and gas industry to Namibia and South Africa is the above ground conditions, so the socioeconomic, the political, the legal structure, plus also then the physical conditions, so the proximity to Walvis, the proximity to other ports, the water depths, etc. So all that make Namibia a very attractive place to operate, never mind the subsurface potential. The next couple of years are going to be very important for the Namibian oil and gas industry, because we now have a situation where the type of equipment that one uses to drill oil wells offshore Namibia, principally 5th and 6th generation drill ships, they are available now at rock bottom prices. So in the last drilling phase in 2013, a well might have cost 100 million euros, $100 million. We have just completed a well that maybe has scraped in below $20 million. So combine ultra-low drilling costs with high oil prices and high cash flow in the industry in general. The combination of that over the next couple of years to drill in what is a frontier exploration area is extremely attractive and extremely important. But just to set the scene briefly on what's happened in Namibia, when we talk to investors, there's a sense of frustration. Well, why haven't they found any oil in Namibia yet? And so let's talk about that for a couple of minutes. So there's three distinct phases in the oil and gas industry offshore Namibia. The first phase is in the 60s and 70s when they had a licensing round, and actually, just like my native country Ireland, the first well found a gas field, the Kudu field, which is now estimated to be 3 TCF of gas, so pretty huge. But unfortunately, it's in an area where there's little demand for gas or little demand for power, so it hasn't been developed. The industry then went into a hiatus because, as was just mentioned, there was the tension between the UN and South Africa, so nothing happened for 10 years. And then the country became independent in 1990, and they started a licensing round, and that's what created the second phase of exploration. And that happened in the early 90s to mid-90s. That was a very important phase of exploration because Ranger and Norsk Hydro drilled wells which encountered the source rock, and the basis of any petroleum system is you've got to have oil being generated to fill these traps. So that was really important, and actually Ranger and Norsk Hydro both went on to try and get more licenses and set up in country to build on those initial, I suppose, traces of oil in their wells, but then the oil price collapsed, and that's a bit of a feature of the Namibian oil industry. Is just as it gets going, the oil price tends to take a nosedive. So then nothing happened, basically until the 2012-2014 drilling phase, which is the third phase. And that phase was led by a bunch of independents and junior exploration companies, so it didn't feature many of the main well-known international oil and gas companies. It was led by companies like HRT and Chariot, who drilled one or two extremely important wells, the most important being the Wingat-1 well, which was drilled by HRT and Galp right in the center of the Walvis Basin, and that for the first time recovered oil to surface offshore Namibia. So that was really important. So while Norsk Hydro and Ranger had given you sniffs of oil, proving that there was oil being generated in the system, seeing is believing. And so the moment of truth was when Wingat recovered this oil to surface to prove that the oil is being generated underneath Namibia's offshore coastline. Then we've moved on to the present day drilling phase, again exploiting the ultra-low drilling cost. 2 wells have just been drilled, and I'm going to go talk in a little bit detail about the results of those wells. But any comments on the history or any alternative views? So to have, and again I'm conscious I'm speaking in a room of geologists and reservoir engineers, etc., but for those of you who don't know, to have a successful oil and gas field, one needs to have 4 elements, and this is a pretty basic refresher course. You need to have a source rock. That's the first element. The source has to migrate, that's the second element, into the third element, which is reservoir, and then it needs to stay there, and that's the fourth element, which is seal. So you have to have all 4 of those elements in place to have the chances of finding a successful and commercial oil field. So where are we in deciphering the Namibian oil and gas code? Source is now unequivocally proven. So the Aptian source rock, the Cenomanian Turonian, and there's likely a Sinrift source rock as well. And so that extends from north to south and is pretty modeled to be pretty pervasive. Again, it was recovered to surface in Wingat, which is on the slide there. It's one of the 4 wells bunched up in the top. Reservoir. So again, to have a successful oil and gas system, you need to have reservoirs, and thankfully Namibian has them in spades. So the reservoir, not only can we see the reservoirs now on the seismic that was generated or collected during the downturn, but you've also got it in recent drilling as well. The 2 most recent wells encountered good reservoir. So we've got those 2 elements ticked off. So where are we currently challenged? And comes on to the recent well results. We're challenged in seal a little bit. It appears that at least one of the recent wells failed because of seal. The good news is this is what the geologists call a shale-prone basin. So there's loads of shale in the area, and that's really good for seal. And there's loads of shapes there, the kind of shapes that trap oil and gas. So the seal should be there, and now it's just a matter of pinpointing where it's most likely to work in commercial quantities and trap that oil. So that's why we've coloured that orange. Charge. We think that one of the more recent wells failed because the trap wasn't charged. So that again is where the source rock has to leak oil into the reservoir. And in one of the recent wells, we think that maybe that was prevented, either by it being a tight source, i.e. the rock wasn't allowing the oil to dribble out of it, or there was a seal underneath the reservoir. So the good news is that the systemic risks, i.e. the risks that would negate Namibia completely, have been disproven. So there is source, it's a shale-prone basin, and there's sand has been injected into the shale to provide the reservoirs, in basic terms. And so the systemic risks are gone. We're now into prospect-specific risks, which is why the next couple of years are really interesting, as the industry can afford to drill a number of exploration wells. And that feeds into plays. The reason why the international oil and gas industry, like Namibia and offshore South Africa, is that the seismic has shown it contains all the play types that have been successful for oil and gas companies around the world. So if you're successful with basin floor fans in one part of Africa or South America, you can find an analog offshore Namibia. If you love channel systems, such as offshore Guyana, you can find them offshore Namibia. These are the well results. I'm really conscious of time. So as I said, Cormorant, and this is our view, so don't take it as gospel. The Cormorant well, the good news is 17 days drilling, so ultra cheap, but using fantastic equipment. I think it was roughly 4,000 meters below sea level, so to drill that in 17 days is fantastic. We think that there was a breach of the trap, evident on seismic pre-drill. That's the fault which we modelled as charging the reservoir, i.e. the source rock had a way of the oil dripping upwards into the reservoir through that fault. We think that that fault then was not sealed and probably provided an escape hatch for the oil to dissipate further, which is why the prospect failed. Prospect S, which is further to the south, closer to the Wingat well actually, we participated with 20%. Working interest, 15 days drilling. Again, this is why Namibia has to move now to take advantage of these ultra-low rig rates to give it a proper go of exploration. We found a fantastic reservoir, which is great. It proves up our model and proved that the sizing was correct. Very good seal, but there was no major amounts of oil. In fact, there was only whiffs of gas, as if a little bit of oil had been managed to get into the reservoir. And so that likely failed due to charge or the source being tight in the area. But the good news is the factors are there for success offshore Namibia. Now we're just getting to the point where we have to find the right prospects. Very quickly, even someone who's done O-level geography will be able to understand why people are excited offshore Namibia. You can see the potential oil fields on seismic. So on the left-hand side, we've got one of our prospects up in the north. That's Pearl 30, a field, a license we share with Echo, Gil, the CEOs in the room. And that is essentially where a river has come to a coastline and dropped all its sediment that it had in suspension and created 100 million years ago probably, created a sand which has now become a reservoir. And then there are analogues of that all around the world, successful analogues. And then on the right-hand side, this is a lookalike to Lisa, which is in Guyana. So this is a channel system. So this is where the sand has been dropped by the river, not as it's gone into an ocean, but just as it has lost its energy and maybe become a more mature river. And so it's great for non-geologists or non-technical people to be able to understand what exactly it is that we're drilling and what we're looking for. So I'll probably leave it at this slide, but the headlines and rumors. So I said in the phase 2013-14 phase, none of the major oil and gas companies, with maybe the exception of Repsol and Galp, participated in the oil and gas period offshore, the exploration period offshore Namibia, but that's all changing now. So the Lundin family, who are very well known petroleum and minerals investors, they have one of the largest acreage positions offshore Namibia. That is including investments they have in Africa Energy, Eco Atlantic, and Impact Oil and Gas, Eco being a real trailblazer in Namibia. Got in before the rest of us. But then you have seen the bigger companies coming in and providing third-party verification, which is very important for us, the smaller companies, to be able to point to investors and say, look, if Shell is interested in this place, if Anadarko is interested in this place, it must be right. So Total and Shell have just done big deals in the Orange Basin. We have it on very good authority that Cosmos are coming in, but that's not public yet. Anadarko have also done a deal in the Orange Basin, which is down in the south. And there's lots of news flow going on. Why don't you all email me and I'll send you these slides, because I don't have time to go through them all. But this is... Sorry?
You sent anyway.
Yeah.
Sorry, may you comment just on the size, distance from shore, ease of extraction?
Sure, absolutely.
Between Namibia and Angola. Can you compare this resource with Angola?
I'm not an expert on Angola, but I'll give you the facts and figures from Namibia. So a lot of the prospects are in water depths ranging from 300 meters to 2,000 meters water depth, and that these days is no issue. That 2,000 meters, you're getting into deep water, ultra deep water, but with the type of equipment that's available, it's not an issue. Any discovery would probably be developed by an FPSO, so floating offshore, and then transported to a refinery, either down in Cape Town or up in Angola. And you're about 150 kilometers from shore and anywhere between 200 and 300 kilometers from Walvis Bay. So that's part of the attraction, is the infrastructure is there, the physical conditions are very good, and the Met Ocean is fine. So there's not big wave heights, there's not big winds, it's all very benign, relatively speaking. And just a quick word, I'll leave you. Namibia, Azinam, our company, we're the 8th largest acreage holder in the entire South Atlantic. So if you take South America and West Africa and exclude Brazil, we're the 8th largest acreage holder. Most of that is in Namibia, a little bit of that is in South Africa. And we're putting together a 7-well drilling program over the next 2.5 years to really exploit these ultra-low drilling costs. The advantage for an investor in a company of our size is if any one of these wells comes in, then we share the wealth with the Namibian government, but it's the investors can make upwards of 4 to 5 times their money, and that's the attraction to equity investors at this stage of the cycle. And this illustrates what I'm saying about the drilling costs. So these are the wells drilled up to 2014, and then these are the most recent wells drilled. And so you can see, as an equity investor, your money is going 4 times as far as it used to, so massively decreasing the risk and increasing your chances of success. So it's 9:30, apologies. And so I'll leave it there. Apologies for slightly curtailing our little presentation. But please feel free to talk to me or Alice, and we can give you our contact details.
Thank you, Daniel.